If Zeno's story begins with losing everything, the second great figure in this history begins almost the opposite way. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born around 4 BCE into wealth, into a well-connected Roman family, into every advantage the empire had to offer, a clever young man with ambition. His path towards Stoicism did not run through a shipwreck. It ran, eventually, through something arguably harder to survive with your principles intact, decades at the absolute center of imperial power. Seneca trained as a young man under Stoic and other philosophical teachers in Rome, and by his 20s he had already built a reputation as a gifted orator, sharp enough that, according to later Roman sources, the Emperor Caligula reportedly considered having him executed, simply for being a more compelling public speaker than the emperor himself, and was talked out of it only because someone convinced Caligula that Seneca was already dying of illness and would not last much longer anyway. He did last considerably longer than Caligula did. His real trouble came a few years later, under the Emperor Claudius, when Seneca was accused of adultery with a member of the imperial family, a charge many historians now consider a politically motivated fabrication rather than an established fact, and banished to the island of Corsica in 41 CE. He spent roughly 8 years there, effectively cut off from the political and intellectual life he had built his entire identity around, watching his career, his connections, and his public relevance all evaporate at once through no clearly proven fault of his own. It is worth sitting with what that exile actually meant in practice. Not a scenic retreat, a genuine professional and social death sentence for a man in his prime, with no fixed date of return and no guarantee one was coming at all. Seneca wrote extensively during this period, including consolation letters to his own mother, working through, in real time and in his own handwriting, exactly the kind of catastrophic reversal of fortune Stoicism had been built to address in the first place. He was not writing philosophy about hardship from a position of safety. He was living the hardship while writing the philosophy, which is precisely the pattern this entire series keeps returning to. Consider what those 8 years on Corsica actually meant for a man of Seneca's temperament and ambition specifically. This was not a person who found quiet contemplation naturally comfortable. He had built his entire early identity around being seen, heard, and admired in the busiest political and intellectual arena in the known world. Exile stripped away every audience he had, leaving him alone with exactly the question Stoicism exists to answer. If the applause, the status, and the proximity to power all disappear at once, is there anything left of you worth calling a self at all? Seneca's surviving letters from this period suggest he was still actively working out the answer, not calmly reciting one he had already settled. In 49 CE, Seneca's exile ended abruptly and dramatically. The Emperor Claudius's new wife, Agrippina, recalled him to Rome for a specific purpose, to serve as tutor to her young son, a boy who would eventually become the Emperor Nero. Seneca went from banished exile to the personal instructor of a future emperor within what must have felt like no time at all. And when Nero took the throne in 54 CE, at only 16 years old, Seneca became one of his 2 closest advisors, effectively running the empire's administration alongside a Praetorian prefect named Burrus for the first several years of the reign. Widely remembered afterward as a genuinely competent, comparatively stable period of Roman governance. This is where Seneca's story becomes considerably more complicated than Zeno's, and considerably more useful for understanding a tension that runs through Stoicism to this day. Seneca became, during these years, one of the wealthiest men in the entire Roman Empire, with estates, investments, and a personal fortune that later Roman critics estimated at an almost unbelievable scale. And he was, simultaneously, one of history's most articulate philosophical voices, arguing that wealth was not a genuine good, that virtue alone mattered, that external fortune should be held loosely. Critics noticed the contradiction immediately, and they were not shy about saying so out loud. How exactly does a man argue for indifference to wealth while personally accumulating one of the largest fortunes in the empire? Seneca actually addressed this criticism directly in his own writing, arguing that the Stoic position was never that a wise man must be poor, only that he must not be owned by his wealth. must hold it the way you would hold a rented, borrowed thing rather than a permanent possession, ready to lose all of it without his actual character changing in response. Whether Seneca fully lived up to that standard himself is a question Roman contemporaries argued about then, and scholars still argue about now. What is not in serious dispute is the quality and honesty of what he actually wrote. His letters to Lucilius, a collection of philosophical letters composed toward the end of his life, remain some of the most genuinely practical, unpretentious Stoic writing that survives from antiquity, dealing plainly with grief, aging, fear of death, the management of time, and the specific temptations that come with power and money, written by a man who had personally experienced an unusual amount of both. He was not a comfortable theorist, describing hardship from a safe distance. He had already survived exile once. He had no way of knowing, while writing most of these letters, that a far worse ending was still ahead of him, arriving directly from the young student he himself had helped raise and educate. One passage from the letters captures the tension particularly well. Seneca advises Lucilius to act in managing his own wealth, as though poverty could arrive at any moment, deliberately practicing simple meals and plain clothing on set days, not as performance but as genuine rehearsal, so that if fortune actually did reverse itself, the transition would find him already prepared rather than shattered. It is the same premeditation malorum this series covered with Zeno's successors in Part 1, except now demonstrated by a man with an actual fortune large enough to make the exercise meaningful rather than hypothetical. For roughly the first 5 years of Nero's reign, the arrangement between tutor and emperor worked about as well as anyone could have reasonably hoped. Nero deferred substantially to Seneca and Burrus on matters of state, and the empire, by most contemporary accounts, was governed with real competence during this window. But the relationship between a philosopher and an absolute ruler with no meaningful check on his own impulses was never going to remain stable indefinitely, and it did not. Nero's behavior began shifting darkly around 59 CE, when he ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, the same woman who had originally recalled Seneca from exile and installed him as tutor in the first place. Seneca's exact role in the aftermath remains genuinely disputed among historians. He appears to have helped draft the public justification the Senate received explaining the killing, a document historians still debate the true authorship and sincerity of. What is clear is that Seneca, a man who had written extensively about virtue, honesty, and the danger of compromising your principles for proximity to power, was now actively working to manage the public narrative around a matricide committed by his own former student. This is precisely the kind of moment that separates comfortable philosophical theory from the genuinely difficult territory of actually living it under real pressure, and it deserves to be presented honestly rather than smoothed over into hagiography. Seneca did not walk away from Nero's court after the murder. He stayed for several more years, continuing to serve as an advisor to an emperor whose behavior was growing more erratic, more paranoid, and more violent with each passing year. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and its aftermath only accelerating Nero's descent further. Whether Seneca stayed out of genuine belief that his continued presence was moderating Nero's worst impulses, or out of simple self-preservation, or some uncomfortable mixture of both motives that even Seneca himself may not have fully untangled, is a question no surviving source answers cleanly. It is worth resisting the temptation to resolve this tension too neatly in either direction. Later Roman moralists sometimes painted Seneca as a hypocrite, wealthy and compromised, while later admirers sometimes painted him as a helpless moderate doing his honest best against an unmanageable tyrant. The historical record supports neither extreme cleanly. What it supports is a considerably more uncomfortable, considerably more human picture. A genuinely gifted philosopher who understood exactly what virtue required, who wrote about it as clearly as anyone in the ancient world ever did, and who nonetheless spent years navigating real compromises inside a system that offered him no clean exit. A predicament that will likely sound familiar to anyone who has ever stayed in a job, a relationship, or an institution longer than their own principles technically justified. By 62 CE, with Burrus dead and Seneca's influence over Nero clearly fading, Seneca formally requested permission to retire from public life entirely, offering to return the wealth Nero had granted him over the years as a gesture of genuine withdrawal. Nero refused the offer of returned wealth, but did allow Seneca to step back from active governance. Seneca spent his final years largely away from the direct machinery of imperial politics, writing the letters to Lucilius during exactly this period, a body of work considerably more focused on personal conduct and inner discipline than on the affairs of an empire he had already watched slip badly out of his own hands. There is something quietly instructive in the timing itself. Seneca did not produce his most enduring, most personally honest writing during his years of greatest influence, when he was actively shaping imperial policy and enjoying the full attention of the most powerful court in the world. He produced it afterward, stripped of most of his former authority, watching from a diminished distance as the student he had raised continued sliding toward tyranny he no longer had any real power to check. The letters read, in places, like a man finally free to say plainly what proximity to power had required him to soften for years. In 65 CE, a conspiracy against Nero's life was discovered, organized around a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, and involving a wide network of Roman elites frustrated with Nero's increasingly erratic and violent rule. The plot was betrayed before it could be carried out, and Nero responded with a purge, ordering executions and forced suicides across dozens of prominent Romans he suspected of involvement, actual or merely convenient. Seneca's connection to the actual conspiracy has never been definitively established by surviving evidence. He may have known about it and declined to participate. He may have been entirely uninvolved and simply useful as a target, a former advisor whose continued reputation and moral authority made him dangerous to an increasingly paranoid emperor, regardless of actual guilt. What is certain is that Nero sent soldiers to Seneca's villa with an order, not an accusation to answer, not a trial to stand, simply a command that Seneca take his own life immediately. The account of Seneca's death, recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, describes a man meeting this final moment with a level of composure that Roman audiences and readers ever since have generally understood as the ultimate practical test of everything he had spent decades writing about. Surrounded by his wife and close friends, Seneca reportedly attempted to comfort them rather than the reverse, reminded them of the philosophical principles he had spent his life teaching, and proceeded calmly through what turned out to be a slow, difficult death, cutting his veins, taking poison, and finally being carried into a warm bath to hasten the bleeding. The entire process reportedly taking hours, rather than the swift end he may have hoped for. Was this performance a final act of political theater designed to secure his historical reputation regardless of what he actually felt in that room? Or was it the genuine, hard-won product of decades spent specifically training himself through exactly the kind of premeditation of adversity this series covered in Part 1, to meet exactly this moment without falling apart? Ancient sources themselves seem uncertain, and modern historians remain divided. What can be said with more confidence is this: whatever the mixture of performance and genuine conviction in that final scene, the letters Seneca left behind, written years before he had any specific reason to expect Nero's soldiers at his door, describe exactly this kind of death, exactly this kind of composure, as the entire point of the philosophical training in the first place. He did not invent a new set of ideas to meet his own execution. He simply, by every surviving account, applied the ones he had already spent a lifetime writing down for other people to use. There is a detail in Tacitus's account worth sitting with specifically. Seneca's veins, cut in the manner considered proper for a dignified Roman death, bled too slowly, given his age and thin frame, to bring the end quickly. He asked for poison as well, and when that too failed to work fast enough, he finally had himself carried into a bath of warm water, reportedly remarking to those around him that he was making an offering to Jupiter the Liberator, treating even the prolonged, undignified difficulty of his own dying as one more piece of material to respond to with composure rather than panic. Whatever else is uncertain about that final afternoon, The specific, repeated failure of the method he had chosen, and his apparent refusal to let that failure rattle him, is difficult to fully explain as pure theater. The second of the three great Roman-era Stoics could not have started his life more differently from Seneca's. Epictetus was born around 50 CE, likely in the town of Hierapolis in what is now Western Turkey, and unlike Seneca, he was born enslaved, a fact that shaped absolutely everything about the rest of his life, and eventually about the philosophy he would go on to teach. He was owned, for a significant portion of his early life, by a man named Epictetus, himself a former slave who had risen to become an influential secretary in the imperial court, first under Nero and later serving other emperors as well. It was likely through this household's proximity to Rome's intellectual and political center that Epictetus was permitted to study philosophy, attending lectures given by a prominent Stoic teacher named Musonius Rufus, one of the most respected philosophical voices in Rome during this period, and by every surviving account, an unusually gifted student even while still legally enslaved. Ancient sources record one especially striking detail about Epictetus' physical condition, that he was permanently lame, and later biographical traditions claim his own master, Epictetus, deliberately broke his leg, either as punishment or simply through casual cruelty. Whether that specific story is literally accurate or a dramatic embellishment added by later writers to sharpen the contrast with his philosophy is genuinely disputed by modern scholars. What is not disputed is that Epictetus lived the rest of his life with a permanent physical disability and built a body of philosophical teaching that returns again and again to a single, unusually hard-won distinction: the difference between what genuinely belongs to you and what does not. At some point, likely following Nero's death in 68 CE, or during the political reshuffling that followed it, Epictetus gained his freedom. He began teaching philosophy publicly in Rome, building a genuine reputation, until the Emperor Domitian, in 93 CE, expelled all philosophers from the city of Rome entirely, a paranoid political move against intellectuals whose independent moral authority Domitian apparently found threatening to his own rule. Epictetus relocated to Nicopolis, a city in northwestern Greece, and it was there, far from the center of imperial power that had once literally owned him as property, that he built the school for which he is actually remembered. The geography of that move is worth pausing on. Nicopolis was not a major intellectual center the way Athens or Rome was. Epictetus built his reputation and his following from what was, by the standards of the ancient world, a relative backwater, with no institutional prestige lending him credibility, no wealthy patron's household smoothing his path the way it once literally had. Whatever pulled students there, and by most accounts, a genuinely significant number of them, did travel considerable distances to study under him. It was not the location's importance. It was the content of what he was actually teaching, which turned out to matter considerably more than where he happened to be teaching it from. There is a detail about Epictetus that makes his enormous historical influence genuinely remarkable and worth pausing on directly. He never wrote anything down himself. Not one word of what survives under his name was physically written by his own hand. Everything we have from Epictetus, the discourses and the shorter Enchiridion or handbook, comes to us secondhand, transcribed and later published by one of his own students, a young Roman named Arrian, who would go on to become a significant historian and military commander in his own right. Arrian tells us directly that he simply wrote down, as faithfully as he could manage, what he personally heard Epictetus say in the classroom, an ancient equivalent of detailed lecture notes rather than a polished treatise Epictetus ever intended for formal publication. This detail matters for understanding Epictetus's actual teaching style. He was not writing careful, considered philosophical prose for a reading audience, the way Seneca was. He was arguing, directly and often bluntly, with real students in a real room, pushing back hard against their excuses, their self-pity, their comfortable evasions, in a voice that comes through even in Arrian's second-hand transcription as sharp, occasionally sarcastic, and completely unwilling to let a student off easy. Where Seneca's letters read like a wise, patient friend writing to you privately, Epictetus's surviving lectures read like a demanding teacher who has heard every excuse you are about to offer him and has already dismantled it before you finish the sentence. His school in Nicopolis reportedly attracted students from across the Roman world, including, according to some ancient sources, wealthy and well-connected Romans who traveled specifically to study under a former slave. A fact that would have been almost unthinkable to acknowledge directly in most other corners of Roman society, and yet inside Epictetus's classroom apparently mattered to nobody at all. What he was teaching did not require citizenship, wealth, or a free birth to access. It required only, as he put it directly to his students again and again, a willingness to finally distinguish between what is actually yours to control and what never was. Arrian himself is worth a brief note here, since the survival of Epictetus's teaching depended entirely on him. A young Roman of considerable means and ambition, Arrian could easily have spent his time on more conventionally prestigious pursuits, and eventually did go on to a significant public career of his own, including a term as a provincial governor and a respected military command. That a person with that trajectory available to him considered his lecture notes from a crippled former slave's classroom worth carefully preserving and eventually publishing says something about how seriously Epictetus was actually taken by the people who sat in that room, whatever his legal status had once been. If you were to compress everything Epictetus taught into a single sentence, and many people since have tried to, it would be the opening lines of the Enchiridion, the short handbook Arrian compiled from his teaching. Some things are up to us, Epictetus said, and some things are not up to us. What is up to us, in his accounting, is a remarkably short list. Our own judgments, our own impulses, our own desires and aversions, our own actions, in short, whatever is genuinely our own doing. Everything else, and this list is considerably longer, our body, our property, our reputation, our position, our career, other people's opinions of us, even ultimately our own physical life itself, belongs to the second category, not up to us, subject to forces entirely outside our authority, no matter how much effort or care we put into managing them. This sounds, on first hearing, almost too simple to be the foundation of an entire practical philosophy. And Epictetus's genius was in relentlessly working out exactly how radical this simple distinction actually becomes once you take it seriously. Most human unhappiness, in his account, comes specifically from confusing these two categories, treating things that are not actually up to us, our reputation, our health, other people's behavior, as though they were within our control, and then suffering enormous, entirely avoidable distress when those things inevitably behave the way things outside our control always eventually behave, unpredictably. Consider how directly this connects back to Epictetus's own biography. His body was not up to him. It never had been, not when he was enslaved, not after his leg was permanently damaged, not after he gained legal freedom either, since bodies remain subject to injury, illness, and eventual death regardless of a person's legal status. His judgments, his own inner responses to whatever happened to that body, were entirely up to him, in every single circumstance, under every condition his life had actually put him through. This was not an abstract philosophical position for Epictetus. It was, quite literally, the only freedom he had ever been permitted to keep, and he built an entire teaching career around insisting that it was the only freedom that had ever actually mattered in the first place. Epictetus pushed the distinction further than most listeners were initially comfortable with. Even your own body, he insisted, belongs technically to the second category, not fully up to you, since illness, injury, and eventually death can claim it regardless of your wishes or effort. This is not a small claim to accept. It means the thing most people spend the most energy protecting, their physical safety and comfort, was never, in Epictetus's accounting, the actual site of their freedom to begin with. The site of freedom was always one level deeper, in the judgment about the body, not the body itself, a distinction that cost Epictetus nothing to arrive at honestly, since his own body had already demonstrated its unreliability to him personally, in the most direct way possible. Epictetus did not stop at simply stating the distinction between what is and is not up to us. He built a demanding, specific, practical discipline on top of it, one he expected his students to actually apply, not merely admire from a comfortable intellectual distance. Take reputation, a source of enormous anxiety for essentially everyone, then and now. Epictetus's position was direct to the point of bluntness. Other people's opinions of you are not up to you. You cannot control what a stranger, a colleague, or even a close friend privately thinks about your character, your choices, or your worth, no matter how carefully you manage your own behavior. Spending your limited attention and energy trying to control something that was never within your authority to control in the first place is, in his account, simply wasted effort. Energy that could instead be spent on the one thing that actually is within your control, whether your own judgment and conduct are genuinely sound. Take loss of property, of position, of a loved one. Epictetus offered his students a specific mental exercise for this, borrowed and sharpened from earlier Stoic thinking. Whatever you value, remind yourself clearly of its actual nature. If you love a cup, remind yourself it is a cup, so that if it breaks, you are not disturbed beyond the ordinary. If you kiss your child or your spouse goodnight, remind yourself you are kissing a mortal being, so that if death takes them, your own preparation, not your love, softens the blow, rather than compounding it into total collapse. Critics have sometimes read this as encouraging emotional coldness or detachment from the people you love. Epictetus's actual students seem to have understood it differently, not as loving less, but as loving without the added, self-inflicted layer of denial that pretends impermanence does not apply to the people closest to you. This discipline, applied consistently, is genuinely demanding, considerably more demanding than simply agreeing with the idea in the abstract. It asks you to continuously sort your own reactions in real time, moment by moment, into what is actually yours to address and what was never yours to begin with, and to redirect your energy accordingly. Every single time the distinction gets tested by an actual event in your actual life. Epictetus taught this discipline to a room full of Roman students for decades. One of the last people known to have studied his teaching seriously, though likely not in person, was about to become the most powerful man in the entire Roman world. There is a further piece of the discipline worth naming, since it prevents a common misreading. Epictetus was not teaching passivity toward the things outside your control. He was teaching selective, disciplined engagement. You still act in the world, pursue your career, care for your health, tend to your relationships, exactly as anyone else would. The difference is entirely in what you attach your peace of mind to while doing it. Pursue the outcome fully. Attach your well-being to the effort and the judgment behind it, not to whether the outcome actually lands the way you hoped. It is a subtle distinction to state, and a genuinely difficult one to live, which is precisely why Epictetus spent decades in a classroom drilling it into students who kept needing to hear it again. Marcus Aurelius was born in Rome in 121 CE into a wealthy, well-connected family, and from a remarkably young age, his life was quietly, deliberately steered toward eventual power in a way that had almost nothing to do with his own early ambition and almost everything to do with decisions made by men considerably more powerful than a child could meaningfully resist. In 138 CE, the reigning emperor Hadrian, who had no surviving son of his own, arranged an unusual succession plan. He adopted a Roman senator named Antoninus Pius as his heir, on the specific condition that Antoninus, in turn, adopt both the 17-year-old Marcus and another young man named Lucius Verus as his own heirs. Marcus, still a teenager, was effectively marked for the imperial throne through a decision made entirely above his head, by an emperor securing his own succession decades in advance, with Marcus's personal preferences barely a consideration in the arrangement at all. What makes Marcus's education genuinely unusual, even among wealthy Roman children who typically received excellent tutoring, was the specific direction his own interests took once philosophy entered the picture. He studied rhetoric extensively under a respected teacher named Fronto, whose surviving correspondence with the young Marcus reveals a warm, genuine friendship, and also, over time, a certain visible frustration on Fronto's part as his star student became increasingly drawn toward philosophy over the more career-practical art of persuasive public speaking. Fronto was actually trying to teach him. The philosophical pull won out. Marcus studied under several Stoic teachers directly, but the single most influential figure appears to have been a philosopher and senator named Junius Rusticus, who is generally credited with introducing the young Marcus to the actual teachings of Epictetus, likely through Arrian's transcribed discourses, since Epictetus himself had died decades before Marcus was even a student. Marcus later wrote, in the opening book of what would eventually become his own private notebook, an extensive list of debts of gratitude to specific people in his life, teachers, family, friends, each credited with a specific quality they had modeled for him. Rusticus, he wrote, taught him to actually read carefully, and specifically credited him with lending him the works of Epictetus, a debt Marcus clearly considered significant enough to record for an audience of exactly nobody, since the notebook was never intended to be read by anyone but himself. It is worth imagining what those early study sessions with Rusticus actually looked like for a teenager already being quietly prepared for imperial succession. Most of the young men surrounding Marcus at court would have been focused on the practical machinery of power, alliances, rhetoric, military command. Marcus, by his own later account, was instead absorbing a philosophy explicitly built by a former slave to argue that none of the very power he was being groomed for was actually worth attaching his own well-being to. Whether Rusticus or anyone else fully grasped the strange tension they were setting up in the future emperor's mind is unrecorded, but Marcus clearly carried it forward, unresolved, for the rest of his life. Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, and Marcus became emperor, initially ruling jointly with his adopted brother Lucius Verus, an arrangement itself unusual in Roman history, two co-emperors sharing formal authority rather than one man ruling alone. Marcus, by most surviving accounts including his own private writing, did not appear to have particularly wanted the position. He had spent years absorbed in philosophical study and appears to have found genuine contentment in exactly that pursuit. The throne arrived regardless, the way a great deal of Marcus's life had arrived through decisions other people had made on his behalf years earlier. What followed was not the calm, comfortable reign of a philosopher given space to think. It was, almost immediately, and then continuously for nearly the entire remainder of his life, a grinding sequence of crises that would have tested any ruler's composure, let alone one who had spent his formative years hoping for a quieter kind of life. A war broke out against the Parthian Empire on the eastern frontier almost immediately after Marcus took power. Returning soldiers brought back with them what historians now generally believe was smallpox, an epidemic remembered as the Antonine Plague, which devastated the Roman population for years and, by some estimates, killed a meaningful percentage of the empire's entire population before it finally burned itself out. As if a war and a plague were not sufficient, Germanic tribes began pressing hard against the empire's northern frontier along the Danube River beginning in 66 CE, forcing Marcus to spend a substantial portion of his remaining reign not in Rome at all, but personally commanding military campaigns on a cold, dangerous frontier, in a war that dragged on, with interruptions, for the rest of his life. Picture the actual position this put him in. A man who had been groomed since his teenage years for exactly this kind of authority, trained extensively in Stoic philosophy, specifically because philosophy was expected to prepare a ruler for hardship, now facing an almost uninterrupted sequence of the worst hardship the empire had seen in generations: war, plague, and financial strain, all arriving essentially at once, with no realistic prospect of the pressure fully lifting before his own death. The financial strain deserves its own mention, since it says something about the character Marcus's education had actually produced. Faced with a treasury drained by war and plague, Marcus reportedly held a public auction of imperial palace valuables, jewelry, silk garments, golden vessels, rather than raise oppressive new taxes on an already suffering population. It is a small, easily overlooked administrative decision, buried in the historical record. and also a strikingly literal demonstration of exactly the teaching he had absorbed as a teenager, that the trappings of power were never the actual substance of it, and could be parted with far more easily than most rulers in his position would have found comfortable. It was during these exact years, on campaign, often in a military tent on the Danube frontier, exhausted, frequently ill himself, that Marcus Aurelius began writing the private notebook that would eventually become the single most famous piece of Stoic literature ever produced, though he had no way of knowing that at the time, and would very likely have been uncomfortable with the idea if he had. The book we now call Meditations was never actually titled that by Marcus himself, and it was never, as far as any surviving evidence suggests, intended for publication at all. The most widely accepted scholarly view is that Marcus was writing a private philosophical journal, addressed directly to himself, likely originally titled something closer to himself in the original Greek, a language Marcus, despite being a Roman emperor, chose to write his private philosophy in rather than Latin, since Greek remained the primary language of serious philosophical writing throughout the ancient world. This detail, that the most famous work of Stoic philosophy was never meant for a single other reader, changes how you should understand almost every sentence in it. Marcus was not performing wisdom for an audience the way a public philosopher writing for publication might be tempted to. He was reminding himself, often bluntly, sometimes almost harshly, of principles he already knew perfectly well in theory, and was clearly still struggling to consistently apply in the exhausting, grinding reality of actually living them. Book after book, entry after entry, frequently repeating the same core ideas in slightly different phrasing, the way a person returns again and again to a lesson they have not yet fully internalized, no matter how many times they have already told themselves. The content itself reads less like a systematic philosophical treatise, and more like exactly what it was: a tired, disciplined man talking himself back into his own principles at the end of an exhausting day or before an uncertain one. Rise in the morning expecting friction and ingratitude from other people, and do not let it disturb you, he wrote to himself, likely because he genuinely needed the reminder that particular morning, not because he was composing a polished aphorism for posterity. You could leave this life right now, he reminded himself elsewhere. So let that determine what you do and say and think. A version of Memento Mori aimed entirely inward at an audience of one, by a man who had personally watched plague kill a significant portion of his empire, and had every reason to take his own mortality seriously, rather than abstractly. Nowhere in the book does Marcus complain, in any sustained way, about the burden of his position, though the exhaustion is visible throughout if you read carefully between the lines. Instead, entry after entry, he returns to the same disciplined question. Given exactly the circumstances you are actually in, not the circumstances you might prefer, what is the right action available to you right now? It is, in its way, Epictetus's dichotomy of control, worked out in real time, by a man testing it against the hardest conditions his entire life had thrown at him: war, plague, exhaustion, and a throne he had never particularly wanted in the first place. The Greek word most often translated as meditations in the book's modern title does not appear in the original text at all, and scholars generally agree Marcus never gave the collection any title whatsoever, since he never intended it to exist as a collection anyone would name. The individual books likely represent separate notebooks kept across different years and different campaigns, later gathered and organized by whoever first assembled them for copying, centuries after Marcus's death, by editors working entirely from a private manuscript never meant to leave his own tent. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, likely near the Danube frontier where he had spent so much of his final years, still actively commanding a military campaign at the time of his death. His private notebook, remarkably, survived the centuries that followed, copied and preserved through a chain of transmission historians still cannot fully reconstruct, until it finally reached print in the 16th century and has remained continuously in circulation ever since. Read by an audience of millions of people, its original author never once imagined or intended. There is something worth sitting with in that fact directly. The most influential surviving work of Stoic philosophy was written by a man who assumed, reasonably, that literally nobody would ever read it. He was not trying to build a legacy or convince an audience or defend a reputation, the way Seneca, fairly or not, has sometimes been accused of doing in his more polished public writing. Marcus was simply trying, in private, book after book, entry after entry, to become slightly more the person his own philosophy told him he ought to be, fully aware, in his own words scattered throughout the text, of how often he was falling short of that standard even while writing it down. This is, in a real sense, the actual argument of this entire chapter, and arguably of Roman Stoicism as a whole. Three men, a statesman who accumulated one of the largest fortunes in the empire and was ultimately ordered to end his own life by the student he had raised, a former slave who owned nothing and built a devoted following on that exact fact, and an emperor who ruled the most powerful nation on earth while privately writing that none of it was really his to keep, arrived, through wildly different lives and radically different circumstances, at essentially the same core teaching: sort what is actually yours from what only feels like it is. Put your full effort into the first category, release your grip on the second. Do this consistently enough, under bad enough conditions, for long enough, and something in you steadies that external chaos was never actually able to reach in the first place. It is worth being honest about what this chapter has not claimed. None of these three men were flawless, and this series has deliberately not presented them that way. Seneca compromised with a tyrant for years and profited enormously while doing it. Epictetus' own teaching, by his own later admission to his students, took him a lifetime to apply consistently, even to himself. Marcus, in his private notebook, repeatedly confesses to falling short of his own standard, sometimes within the same page he had just restated it on. The point was never that these men achieved some flawless, finished state of wisdom. The point is that each of them kept returning to the same demanding standard anyway, decade after decade, failure after failure, which is a considerably more honest and considerably more useful model than a myth of effortless sages who never struggled at all. That teaching, tested by exile, slavery, plague, war, and a forced death sentence, is what actually survived 2,000 years, considerably better than the empire that produced it did. What happened to it after these three men died? How a philosophy this specific and this demanding nearly vanished entirely, and how it quietly found its way back into your century without most people even noticing where it came from, is part 3. If watching three very different lives arrive at the same conclusion changed how you think about any of this, subscribe. Part 3 covers the 4 virtues, the core practices, and exactly how Stoicism nearly disappeared and then came back. And if you want a daily practice built on exactly this tradition, Becoming Stoic is a free app built for exactly that.